Welcome back to our fifth week of our Kingdom Citizenship study. And this week we are looking at helpful ways to think about faith and politics. And today we are talking about what I call the straight jagged and principle tactics distinction. Let me start by kind of explaining this chart that we have behind me. On the x-axis, we have what we would call straight line issues, which are issues that are clearly translated from the Bible into political law or civil law today. And then on this end, we have what we would call jagged line issues, those areas that are not clearly taken from the Bible, or that clearly translate from the Bible to civil or political actions or policies. Instead, they must be built upon a number of assumptions and some other things. Now, on the y-axis over here, we have at the top, we have principles, those things that we hold to, and then on the bottom we have tactics. We have kind of the specific ways and measures and means that you use to achieve a certain principle. And it is helpful to think about any political topic in terms of these two axes. And it affects how willing we are to show freedom and charity to other Christians who have different views than us. And so when we can kind of chart where a particular issue falls out on this diagram, it can really help us parse where our differences are and how concerned we should be about those. The problem is today, everyone just deals with all of these things in one big blob called politics, and it usually doesn't translate to very good discussions or contributions. Now, let's first distinguish between the straight line issues and the jagged line issues. And this distinction comes from Robert Benet's book, Good and Bad Ways to Think About Religion and Politics. He writes, "The problem is that the connections between the central claims and political policies are too certain and confident. Too straight a line is drawn. Rather, one must traverse a number of lines in an argument to move from those central claims to specific public policies. Each link provides an opportunity for Christians of goodwill and intelligence to disagree on the movement from the center to public policy. Factors other than faith claims enter into that movement." And so as we trace that, what are some of the steps that we should take to decide if something is a straight line issue or maybe more of a jagged line issue? Well, the first step is figuring out, what does the Bible say? The problem is most folks just go from there and jump all the way to drawing a straight line from that to a public policy. So someone might point to Acts chapter 4, verse 32 and 33, where it says, "All who believed were together and had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need." And then they draw a straight line from that to say, socialism is the only Christian option, which some folks have done. But there are several problems with drawing that straight line. And one is it doesn't take into account what all of Scripture has to say, and it also doesn't take into account your own interpretation of what Scripture has to say. And that's why you need to take the second step, which is then gathering all of the relevant passages in the Bible and seeing how they've been interpreted by the church throughout history. It's developing a body of teaching that draws on the Bible and historical theology to articulate social positions. The Catholic Church has done a great job of this. They have a vast collection of what they call their social teachings that are theologically rich and are very helpful. They have thought robustly about a number of these issues. Our own denomination, the Presbyterian Church in America, has put forth a number of study committees that have published reports that tries to do this type of thing. Going back to our early church example in the book of Acts, if you just jump to the next chapter, in Acts chapter 5, Peter tells Ananias and Sapphira, two early members of the church, that they were not required to sell their property and did not even have to give all their proceeds to the church if they had sold their property. And so you see, you can't build a political policy from just one verse, but it needs to examine all of Scripture and then see how those Scriptures have been interpreted in various historical contexts. So now that you've done that, the next step that one would take is now applying that biblical theology into a particular situation. going back to the book of Acts, where it talked about Christians selling their possessions and giving the proceeds to the church as people had need. Well, we need to realize that we live in a different situation than those early Christians did. For instance, back then, people stored their wealth in things like land and sheep and goats and cows and their possessions. Today, we have bank accounts. Probably not many of you have your retirement savings invested in a bunch of cows in your backyard. There are also today various government social welfare programs that didn't exist back then. The point is, we need to take into account, we need to take that biblical principle and then see what historical and situational factors affect how that principle would be applied today. And then the fourth step we take is to develop a public policy. And this is where it gets really messy because there are many competing interests in politics. There's the necessity of compromise, and it can be very difficult to do well in that step. So what we see as we kind of move out through that four-step process is something like this, where we say the biblical teaching and hopefully you guys can see that. And as you move from step 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, we're kind of getting further away. It's the biblical teaching is narrowing down, and then what is becoming more and more important is what we would say wisdom, right? Wisdom for how to apply that into our particular situation. And we're going to look at why wisdom is so important in our next video. So taking these 4 steps helps to guard against your own blind spots and biases that can have a significant impact on how you think. And what are some of the things that influences those biases? Well, Benet in his book gives us a number of them. He says family, culture, and history. Your parents' political views had a big influence on your political views, even because you align with them or you're reacting against them. Your regional culture and history. Think of the difference that someone would have growing up in the North versus the South in the 1800s. Your national culture and history. If you grab a Christian from the United States and from the UK and from Canada, you'll discover some surprising political differences, even though you all love Jesus. There are the traditions of Western culture that have a big influence on us. It was striking in all of this COVID stuff is early on there were a number of reports coming out from churches in Asia and places like Taiwan, Japan, and elsewhere. And they were writing reports of, for the Western church, here's how we have dealt with COVID, and this is what we've seen to work well and to allow us to keep worshiping together. And those steps that they took were things like everyone wore masks, everyone would get their temperature checked when they went to the building. They would recommend taking pictures of seeing where everyone was seated for contact tracing in the event that somebody was sick, and they had no problems with that. They were saying, here's our gift to the rest of the world, churches throughout the rest of the world. Here's how we have been able to keep worshiping in the middle of this pandemic. But now it gets to the United States, and guess what? Just the very issue of whether or not we wear masks in worship is a big area of contention for Christians. And imagine if we tried to do all those other things that these Asian churches had done. It would be, seen as an affront to our liberty. Now, why is it, though, that in the United States so many churches have maybe couched resistance to some of these measures in Christian and theological terms, while many of the Christians in Asia didn't seem to have any problem with those sort of things? Well, maybe it's because it is less of a biblical thing and more of a cultural thing. And we need to be aware of that. Your race, your class, your gender, and marital status can all have a big impact on how you think about these things. If you are going to a wedding as a single person, what are you thinking about? Why isn't it mine? If you're going to a wedding as a married person, what are you thinking about? The good feelings of your own wedding. Right? You can be at the same event and have yet 2 very different experiences depending on your own life situation. And that translates into big differences when it comes to thinking about political things. You are a product of your own environment, and we need to be aware of that. So when you are looking at a particular issue, you need to work through these steps that we outlined to decide, all right, is this more of a straight line issue where it seems that everything is pretty clear cut, or is this more of a jagged line issue where there are certain cultural assumptions and other things that I need to hang this argument on for it to come out on the other side as a political policy? Abortion is a good example of a fairly straight line issue in terms of law, while healthcare policy is more of a jagged line issue. Again, talk to Christians in Canada and in the UK and in America, and we will all probably have very different ideas of what good healthcare looks like. Now, let's look at our next axis, the difference between principles and tactics. Having gone through that previous process, you should have some idea of where a particular issue lies on this end of the spectrum. And I realize going through all that stuff probably sounds like a ton of work. And you're like, how in the world can I do that for everything? Well, fortunately, you can leverage the work of other people. There's a lot of good resources out there. But even just having this basic graph in mind, you can do just some quick mental thought and get an idea, okay, is this more over here or more over here? And I bet you'll have a pretty good chance of at least getting it in the right quadrant. And that can help immensely when talking with other people. So the next step that you want to take is differentiate between the principles and the tactics. I think abortion is a good example here. Our denomination published a study report in the late 70s on abortion, and they stated that because Scripture clearly affirms the sanctity of human life and condemns its arbitrary discussion, we affirm that the intentional killing of an unborn child between conception and birth for any reason at any time is clearly a violation of the sixth commandment. So that is the principle of the matter. They worked through these 4 steps. You can read the thing. I forget how many pages it is, but it's like probably close to 100 pages, okay? They went through this thing very thoroughly. They were good Presbyterians. So that is the principle. But now you can agree on the principle, but have a very different idea of the tactics that you need to use in order to pursue seeing that principle working its way out into society. So for instance, some Christians would argue for building and then supporting crisis pregnancy centers. Others would say we need to push for changes in law at the state level to lessen the number of abortions. Maybe it's pushing for sex education classes to limit the amount of unwanted pregnancies. Maybe it's precipitating. For some reason, I can't seem to say that word right now. Maybe it's participating, there we go, in March for Life walks or rallies. Maybe it's going to abortion clinics and protesting there and trying to persuade women from entering. Maybe it is encouraging a broader support of adoption. These are all tactical decisions. And some of them you might say, oh, I could do that. Some of them you might be neutral on. Some of them might really bother you. But it is important to realize that someone can hold to the same principle and yet have different ideas on the tactics. Now, one thing is, though, we tend to, because of just our sinful natures, overvalue and overestimate how good our tactics are. Well, I really like to do this, and underestimate someone else's. But with anything on the tactical level, there is a lot of Christian liberty and wisdom at play. And so we need to rejoice that we might be united in principle, even if we differ on our tactics. And be careful not to create some sort of hierarchy of righteousness, because, well, we think, these are the most Christ-like tactics, and these are the ones that are okay but not very Christ-like. That these are the ones that the best Christians do, but these are ones for, maybe C Christians. No, anything that falls on this side of tactics, we need, and that's what I've got marked up here, we need to hold very loosely and not be willing to die on those hills, because it's probably not worth dying over or even getting into a really heated argument over. This is why Mark Deaver, who's a pastor at Capitol Hill Baptist Church in Washington, D.C., he is staunchly pro-life, and yet he won't promote a pro-life march from the pulpit of the church, even if he would go attend it later that day, because he does not want to communicate that Christians, as a matter of conscience, must adopt the political tactic of marches. Christians need to be, and particularly churches, need to be very careful of realizing that when they start going into this realm with a certain attitude, people might think, oh, that is what it means to be a Christian. When really the bar to be a Christian is to profess Jesus Christ as Lord and trust that God has raised him from the dead. So, we as Christians need to be careful. The other place we need to be careful is on this side between straight line and jagged line issues. If you look here, in each quadrant, so maybe we're clear on the principle of the matter, but it's a jagged line for how it works out to policy, we need to be loose. We talked about anything on the tactic side, we need to be loose. The only quadrant that we can really hold firm as a church and as Christians largely is where the principle is clear and it is a straight line issue. And that is where the church needs to be firm. But when we start putting that same level of firmness into these areas, one, it tends to create something of a legalistic culture. And also, it essentially undermines the gospel by adding to, oh yeah, you can be a Christian, but if you want to be a really good Christian, well, you need to agree on this, this, or this, which in the end, the gospel always loses. That's it for this video. Hopefully it's been helpful for you to think of through these things, and send us your comments and questions so we can address them in our next week.